Thank you for this invitation and for this lovely introduction. I would like to add that when we discussed what topic I should address in this talk, given your course, we decided it needs to be something around the histories of exhibitions and exhibition making practices. And then, of course, we narrowed down to the Serbian case, and then we narrowed down to this particular case in which we can notice the major change of paradigms which is affected in the exhibitionary practices, which means the late 60s and the early 70s, when the modernist paradigm of the white cube was challenged with something that we call new artistic practices. Of course, the very term new artistic practice needs to be elaborated immediately, because, of course, there could be other terms to describe this change of paradigms. We are, of course, using this term because primarily as a student of Professor Jerko de Negri, I picked this term from him. And I think that this term was first used in the second half of the 70s, maybe for the first time, really for the exhibition Nova umjetnička praksa, new artistic practice in Zagreb in 1978, where Dimitrijević and de Negri were curating. And the idea was to kind of introduce this term, I would suppose, based on writings by, on the one hand side, Germano Celant, and on the other hand side, Catherine Millet, who were using this term, and to explain this concoction of conceptual art practices, land art practices, performance art practices, arte povera, and all these kind of paradigmatic changes that we are witnessing. I will address this topic through the exhibition histories to see how in exhibitions and within the institutional politics in Serbia, practice was presented, what were the challenges, what were the dilemmas, what were the obstacles, both institutional and cultural in general, and then basically to go through some images, because I suppose that such an interest in the history of exhibitions and exhibition practices, for me it's very interesting, because I belong to the generation who studied art history without really addressing the question of exhibition as a media in which certain artistic practice appears and is presented to the public. Usually you learn art history as something given through images, but only, I would say, in the last 20 years, this whole topic of the histories of exhibitions was raised. And at the beginning, I must also say that my lecture will also heavily rely on the research primarily done by Jelena Vesic, a colleague of mine, who has been investigating exhibition policies in Serbia of the 70s. You can find this on Transit.org website under the project Parallel Histories, where she researched major exhibitions, which were not, I would say, researched before, even by those who were interested in historization of this period. Of course, given that primarily this talk will be addressed to students, I will try to be as much introductory as possible, but of course, we will hopefully have a discussion so we can broaden some of the issues. So I will start, of course, sharing the screen and go directly to my slideshow. That was not the first one, but it will be. So the chronology here is primarily done from 1967 to 1983, because we can say that 1967 could be the pivotal year, although still not in the art institutions, but it was the year when the International Theatre Festival in Belgrade called BITEF was established. And even at the first edition of BITEF in 1967, certain forms of practices that were already bordering with the regular classical theater appeared. So the audience in Belgrade in 1967 was able, for example, to see the performance by Living Theater, an American alternative theater group. And I suppose this experience was one of these kind of formative experiences for the new generation to see how this idea of political emancipation, of sexual emancipation, of challenges to the establishment and challenges to the cultural establishment in general was somehow introduced, and what became how it became visible. And already at the second edition of BITEF in 1968, something called Galeria 212, Gallery 212, was founded during the BITEF festival, in the theater during the BITEF festival events. And it was curated by Biljana Tomić, who was most definitely the first, we can say, contemporary art curator in Serbia, given that we are, of course, speaking now to these times from our own point of view. And definitely from our own point of view, we can discern that in the practice of Biljana Tomić already in the late 60s, we can find this change of paradigm from the notion of a curator as someone who is linked to the institution and someone who is linked with caring and taking care of the works of art, into some kind of active a person who's also producer, not only producer of exhibitions, but also co-producer of art projects as well. So we can say that already BITEF in 1968 brought for the first time some of the artists that we can relate to the new artistic practices, but definitely in 1969, it was the group OHO that appeared at the BITEF festival and made a very strong impact on the Slovenian group OHO, made a very strong impact on the Belgrade audience. But before I turn to that, just to give just a brief explanation of the institutional situation in Belgrade and in Serbia at the moment. Of course, when we talk about this period of time and we talk about Serbia, of course, I have always a problem because, of course, the country was called Yugoslavia, and this institution that you see here, and this is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade, was established with the idea that this will be the institution for the entire Yugoslav artistic space. That this will be an institution which will follow, collect, and present works of art from the beginning of the 20th century on in Serbia, Slovenia, Croatia, and other places in Yugoslavia, with the idea to construct an overall collection and an overall point of view, and also critical reception of that kind of practices. So already then it was opened in 1965. The museum and its director, Miodrag Protic, who was this kind of archetypical high modernist person, started a series of major exhibitions called the Yugoslav Art of the 20th century. And the second of these exhibitions, the slide on the right, was dealing with the art of the 1920s. And it was called the constructive painting and other art practices of the 1920s. And I think that this exhibition in 1967 is essentially important because it was for the first time that in the institutional framework within the history of modern art in this particular institution, but in general other institutions, a part of the exhibition was dedicated to the historical avant-garde, to the Yugoslav historical avant-gardes of the 1920s, primarily to Zenithism, and to Yugo-Dada, to Yugoslav Dadaist movement. I would say that this is kind of quite important because we can see that simultaneously this institution was on the historical level introducing different kind or different possibilities of reading history of art by introducing something that has been either omitted or totally forgotten within the regular art history and the artistic practice as well, simultaneously working on this kind of development of some kind of a lineage that Ješa de Negri was then by the end of the 70s coining into the other line, with this idea that there is this kind of parallel history of modern art, which is not about what we can call aesthetical modernism, or this kind of a modernism that is based on the Greenbergian and similar modernist accounts, but something that Thierry Diver would later call generic modernism, this kind of idea of art as a kind of transcategorial thing, and something that is going beyond it is the question of ontology of art and not only of the aesthetics of art. That's why I'm mentioning that only in 1967, audience in Belgrade will be able to see the works, magazine of Zenit and other works by avant-gardists of the 1920s, which is, I think, very important given the fact that the whole mission behind the Museum of Contemporary Art was, of course, quite ceremonial. It was supposed to become a major institution. As you can see, this building is quite striking, famous design by very young architects Ivan Karaspopovic and Ivan Antic. Who did this fantastic modernist building with intersected internal spaces, with this kind of glass structure, glass roofs, a little bit outside of the city center, as some kind of a real modernist dream, this kind of idea that in some sense of isolation, you will contemplate modernist works of art. Also, it's interesting, of course, on the third photo on the left, you definitely recognize the president of Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito, on a photo visiting Museum of Contemporary Art and looking at a famous sculpture by Ivan Meštrović, together with Mayor Belgrade and Miodrag Protic. I usually kind of briefly illustrate the institutional and general ideological situation behind the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade by the simple fact that museum was Miodrag Protic initiated the building of the museum already in 1959. In 1962, the building became the construction of the building started, and it was the very same year when Josip Broz Tito, for different kind of reasons, let's not enter into that, had a couple of speeches in which he accused heavily modern art as some kind of a decadent Western invention, some kind of just a decorative thing, something that's not real art, and so on. So it was this kind of a speech from the top of the political power, denigrating entirely the modern art. So one would say that in this kind of climate, how was it possible that the museum was erected anyway? How was it possible that the founder of the museum was not even a member of the Communist Party? And I think that this is saying a lot in general about the cultural policies in Yugoslavia, and again about this kind of a myth that there was just this kind of central power who was making all decisions and so on. So Tito didn't like this kind of art, but it didn't really interfere into building this building and dedicating the funds for this building. So 1967, 1969, I already said that a group, sorry, no, this is not, my computer has bugged. I apologize.
Can we assist you in some way?
I know I have, my computer is frozen.
Ah, okay.
I don't know what to do. I'm not trying to escape. Nothing happens because I'm in full screen. I don't see cursor. I can only do escape.
If you need to...
the computer is frozen, or only you cannot move the PowerPoint?
I cannot. It doesn't react. It doesn't react at all.
Yes, it does. You just have to touch the first. Yeah, just go back now. It will.
Okay, no, one moment it was like totally. So you see here, for example, the members of the Oho group in front of the Museum of Contemporary Art in 1970. And already by this very photo, I love this photo, because by this photo, it shows this kind of a relation, this new generation established to this kind of a canonical institution of modernist culture. As I put, Group Oho already had during the BITEF in '69 performance, and then their first exhibition in Serbia, in Novi Sad, in November 1969. The exhibition was later moved to Belgrade in the early 1970 to Dom Omladine in Belgrade. And here we are encountering the first alternative or youth cultural institutions that we will mention in this talk. And this is so-called Tribina Mladih, or the Youth Tribune, and cultural center founded in Novi Sad already in the 60s, which apparently by the in the early 60s, apparently in the late 60s, is already had such an editorial program that was aware of that kind of changes in artistic practice, and invited Oho to to exhibit there. And the exhibition of Oho was, of course, like nothing else seen in Serbia at this particular moment. It was an exhibition that was divided into different sections. I think that maybe the entire exhibition was like 20 days or something, but like 5 days each member of the group had his own separate show. And I like this from the text. This was called Grandfathers was the name of the exhibition. The exhibition was before in Zagreb as well. I like this because it shows how this idea of exhibition was transformed, you know, because they're saying in this text, in the catalog of the exhibition, they're making this kind of statement that in Novi Sad, they will arrive on Saturday, November 1st, 1969, and with us, we will bring 100 meters of string, tessaflex, fabrics, chalk, a lock with the key, smoke tubes. I don't have a clue what smoke tubes are, roto paper, and wax. So this is the kind of material bringing it with them in order to make an exhibition. So by this very, list of things that will be used, this is not the list of things that will be exhibited, but they will be used for the production of the work on site. And I think that this is one of this kind of a pivotal moment, which was especially important for Novi Sad. But let's return to the situation in Museum of Contemporary Art. This photo of Oho was made in 1970 during something that was called the Triennial of Yugoslav Art that was held in Belgrade. The first one was 1961. This was the fourth triennial. And it's interesting that this triennial was, of course, a typical institutional exhibition with a lot of participants, with this kind of ambition to cover the entire artistic space of Yugoslavia. At that time, that Group Oho was recognized already as something that was a part of this Yugoslav art space. So they were also invited and participated in the exhibition 1970. In 1971, two exhibitions happened, which were also very important for the history of exhibition making in the Museum of Contemporary Art. On the left, you see the exhibition of Dada, which was in 1971 in the Museum of Contemporary Art, which kind of continues with this idea of and this interest in the historical avant-garde. And in the other space of the Museum of Contemporary Art, in its salon, which was a gallery dedicated mostly for solo art shows, of course, both institutions still function. The first ever exhibition of conceptual art was made. This was the exhibition called The Examples of Conceptual Art in Yugoslavia, curated by Biljana Tomic and Jesha De Negri. So a very important couple, because of course Biljana was working mostly on the independent scene, whereas De Negri was curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art. And he somehow managed the trotage and the curatorial board of the museum, which was by definition very conservative at that moment, especially conservative to this kind of a new type of thinking and exhibiting art. But nevertheless, this exhibition did happen in March 1971, and you can see who were the participants. So one can say that was the first generation of conceptual artists in Yugoslavia, starting with Oho and Nuša and Srećo Dragan from Ljubljana, then the group pensioner Tihomir Simčić, which is Goran Trboljak and Branislav Dimitrijević, and finally two groups from Novi Sad, which emerged, first group called already in April 1970, which could be also read as some kind of a direct impact made by Oho exhibition and their presence in Novi Sad. Of course, one should not overestimate that, because this group was already, the people were knowing each other and they were already working and interested in concrete poetry, in conceptual art. Most of them were not really artists, but coming from the linguistic part. But apparently this was something that was initiated and already in 71 exhibited under the premises of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade. One can also, who is interested in this, find out an interesting curiosity with this exhibition, that when you see the names of the present artists, there was no one from the Belgrade conceptual scene. So for the local history, it's very, very interesting to note that it was in Novi Sad that this kind of practice was first somehow happening. And then Belgrade only in summer 1971 with the founding of the Student Cultural Center. And as you can see from there's very scarce documentation about this exhibition. This is the simple catalog with the text by De Negri, which is our historical text, and the short text by Biljana Tomic, which is some form of artistic statement, which also shows the spirits of the time. You can read this artistic statement over here. But in general, as an exhibition, of course, this exhibition was quite conventional, because it was still the question how to think the conventional exhibitions in relation to new artistic practice. So the entire exhibition consisted entirely of the documentary materials, texts printed on paper, and photographs printed on paper behind the glass. So it was some kind of a very administrative exhibition, which is again opening this issue of representability and exhibitionability of new artistic practice, how to capture this relation between art and life, how to capture all this agenda, which of course I don't have really have time but to go into, but in the whole ontological and aesthetical aspects of the so-called new artistic practice. So the first exhibition was conventional in those terms, but historically extremely important, because it shows that the Belgrade Museum is somehow one of the first museums in the world, one of the first official museums in the world that had exhibitions of conceptual art. Only a year before MoMA had this Kineston McShine's exhibition Information. It was 1970. Again, Oho participated at this show, and I suppose the same year also the famous exhibition, the Stedelijk Museum happened. But then these are like kind of just a few examples in which we can add also Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade as one of the kind of institutions that were kind of flexible and emancipated enough to open its institution to this kind of practice. So 1971 examples of conceptual art in Yugoslavia, which, as I told you, also included the first works of that kind happening in Serbia, primarily the works by Grupa Kod, which is still remains one of the, I would say, still quite under-researched phenomena, given that it is very complicated as an object of research, because this whole idea behind of this group was this kind of idea of ephemerality of art, this kind of idea that they really didn't want to become professional artists. They didn't want to be a part of any kind of artistic institution. They were kind of thinking art in this kind of extremely utopian, under extremely utopian premises that were, of course, following the 1968 year and the events of the 1968. Under which the institutional culture needs to be basically demolished, and a certain kind of freedom of expression that will no longer be linked in the exhibitionary manner to the gallery system as well. So one of their first performances were, of course, not happening in the gallery. They were happening in the theater, like the one on the left, the action Zglob, from May 1970, a series of fluxus-like random actions. This one involving some guy with a chainsaw who was their guest and kind of making something with this chainsaw on the. So this is the practice that was generating a lot of antagonism in the very small and very dormant town of Novi Sad at that moment, kind of resisting to anything new. There are other projects during the 1970s in which they want to expand this idea of exhibition to the public space. Was, for example, the photo on the right, the project by Janez Kocijancic, who was one of the members of the group, called Restoran kod Kod, Restaurant at Kod, which basically meant that they were on the main square in Novi Sad. They placed tables with chairs, like in a typical restaurant, and this usual inventory of things on the tables, but everything painted in like some blue color, some one color, like bottles, plates, glasses, knives, and everything that you would expect to be. And so the idea behind the work was, of course, that they were not participating there. They were just standing outside of the work and taking photos of how people will somehow relate to this particular situation or this particular intervention they find in their city, whether they will sit down, whether they will steal something, what will be their behavior around them. So this is really one of the first examples of that kind of participatory art that was kind of opening this field for something that we today in contemporary art practices consider quite common and quite usual as a practice. also to continue with this innovatory models of exhibition making. This is also a project by Grupa Code, together with Goran Trbuljak from Zagreb, called the Public Art Class, where basically they were on the spot on the bank of the river Danube in Novi Sad, constructing works and constructing situations out of the found material and out of some kind of stuff they brought with themselves there. So the idea that this is an exhibition, that this is kind of can be regarded as a kind of a blurring of the distinction between producing and exhibiting works of art was, of course, kind of from historical point of view, is very, very, very important. Also, different kind of actions of that kind happened in Novi Sad in 1970. I'm particularly using this one because this was an artist who was not belonging to the group. She was a little bit older. Her name is Bogdanka Poznanović. She was a painter. But together with her husband, who was a translator, she became some kind of a guru of this kind of, or some kind of very influential figure for this new generation. And this is her project called Heart Object, in which practically like this kind of a constructed heart with a metronome inside of it ticking, was paraded through Novi Sad and ended up in the gallery of Tribina Mladih. So, and then it was exhibited in the Tribina Mladih. So this idea, so how to move something from the streets, from the real life, into the gallery space and to make some sense out of it. So at this particular moment, it was clear that Tribina Mladih was becoming an institution which is ready and prepared to accommodate that kind of a practice. And of course, you can imagine that this didn't go without obstacles and without different kind of political troubles. Of course, these political troubles were part of the general cultural situation. I would not say that this was not only some kind of a political decision from above, but it was also the animosity towards this production by so-called traditional artists who kind of campaigned against this kind of stuff. And soon, already in 1971, Tribina, and then definitely 1972, Tribina Mladih changed its editorial board, particularly Judita Šalgo, who was an essential figure for Novi Sad scene. And, after that brief period, basically it became just a regular cultural center. So this is a very brief history in a way, the history which ended up in a very dramatic circumstances, given that at the end of the whole events around this group, around the publishing of the magazine Index, which was also part of their activity and so on. Two members of the group, Miroslav Mandić and Slavko Bogdanović, also got jailed, get a jail sentence, which is, as far as I know, the only instance of a so-called visual artist jailed in Serbia, at least, but I think in general in Yugoslavia. So, this is to show that what was happening. Why to make it just a brief point before I continue with the images. The situation is apparently that facilitated by one way or the other by the institutions themselves, which I think it's very important to note. That one would think that this type of culture, that this type of art would be treated under the banner of so-called dissident, non-conformist, alternative art, and especially dissident in terms of the socialist cultural system, or the system of high modernism, socialist high modernism, let's call it like this, that one would expect that this kind of practice to evolve entirely outside of the institutions. But the whole system and especially the system of so-called youth culture was already informed by new cultural practices. So a lot of people who are following this were already part of the institutions. They were editors or curators within the institutions. So we need to note that in the case of Tribina Mlade, it's the Youth Cultural Center, but also somehow in the case of Museum of Contemporary Art, new artistic practices in Serbia happened within or around institutions, at least, which I think it's important to note when we follow later because other practices, of course, just very briefly, Balin Sombati was a member of the Bocek Group, which founded already in 69, but basically in 70, also they started with the conceptual practices. Balin Sombati, who, as other members of the group, leaned very much on the Hungarian avant-gardes of the 20s, especially on Lajos Kasak, and so this kind of establishing, that's why I'm mentioning this kind of the simultaneous interest on the behalf of art historians, particularly into the historical avant-gardes of the 20s, and the new artistic practices of the late 60s somehow corresponded, and they got their kind of mutual influence. So Balin Sombati was this kind of basically using the street as an exhibition space. This is, for example, a work Lenin in Budapest, in which he paraded the image of Lenin around the streets of Budapest, as a solitary action. This kind of or on the right hand side, his small flat apartment in Novi Sad, where he lived in some kind of mansarda that he entitled Bauhaus. So it was kind of his house was about, so his home was a gallery space, streets were a gallery space, or the other member of the Bocek Group, Slavko Matkovic, who already in 1973 started this project called Authorization. I think until the late 80s, he continued with this, in which he was basically producing either like small works of his on paper, or some invitations for exhibitions, and would deliver them and place them around the city, putting them in the post boxes, leaving them on the streets, leaving them on the trees, leaving them on the cars, giving them to people, and so on. So you would, for example, in one of the iterations of this project, you would, for example, receive an invitation for an exhibition which doesn't exist, So he with the idea, with his hope that some people would go to this particular spot after this invitation and themselves create some kind of a situation of the people who wanted to go to see this exhibition. The exhibition never happened, and it's not there in place. So all this kind of a conceptualist strategies that really evolved around the discourse of the exhibition. Slavko Matkovic, Authorization. But let's go back to Belgrade, because interestingly that in 1971, the year when the backlash in Novi Sad started against the Index magazine and against the whole group, Belgrade Student Cultural Center was finally established. There are a lot, of course, theories around how this happened. Was this kind of a top political decision that after 1968 protests, the system needs to establish some kind of a ghetto or some kind of a space where this critics of everything possible, that was the kind of, as the one of the slogans of 1960, 8 and the philosophical slogan, this kind of idea of criticism of everything, where all these people were somehow placed into a cultural center and be given the space to continue their artistic experiments. This is the building. Interestingly, it was some kind of a ballroom, officer ballroom before the Second World War, in front of the royal stables. And so this building was kind of given to students, the student union, to establish the particular center for student culture. Interestingly, this is the moment in which, in institutional terms, the division was created between the so-called youth culture and the so-called student culture, because the youth house or the youth center already existed in Belgrade. Together with Tribina Mladih, it was established somewhere in the early 60s. And this idea behind the youth center was, of course, that this will be kind of an open space for every kind of activities, including amateur activities and so on. But with the establishment of the Student Cultural Center, there was this kind of reflection of some kind of a need to do something more intellectual, to address this kind of intellectual youth, and to kind of, kind of the awareness that this kind of culture is not only a youth culture, but there's some kind of added value to it. So Belgrade conceptual art scene, or Belgrade scene of new art practices, started in Student Cultural Center. One can say that maybe it started with this exhibition. It's called Drangularium or Trinketarium, if you can Trinketarium can be translated into English, in which some of the kind of wide group of artists, some of whom later would be recognizable as artists of the new artistic practice, by curatorial invitation, were invited to present an object or something that they are particularly keen about. So the idea was not to exhibit works of art, but to invite artists to exhibit something which is not a work of art, but it is something that is somehow related to them, dear to them, they're affected by them. And you can imagine that the general responses were quite diverse. But already some of the kind of artists that would be later recognizable, like Rasha Todosievich, who also figures on the invitation for this lecture, one of his works, all at that time did something else. He basically exhibited his girlfriend, Marinella. He put her to sit there, and also a cake made by his mother. So it's like entire libidinal situation between a girlfriend and a mother is also related here. But I would say that this particular exhibition was some kind of, let's say, attempt to do something else with the opening of the gallery of Student Cultural Center, to do something which is not a regular exhibition, but it was this exhibition that could be the first real exhibition of conceptual art in Student Cultural Center, and this was the exhibition at another moment, curated by Branislav Dimitrijević and Nena Dimitrijević, which was a repetition of the exhibition they did in a kind of independent space in Frankopanska Street in Zagreb. So it's like in a non-gallery space. And in this statement, because of the timing, I will not read it. You can read the part of her. You can read the part of her statement. But in general, she's showing, Nena is showing this concern of how an exhibition that is envisaged for a non-gallery space or for a non-institutional space is now accommodated by an institution. And but it was an exhibition that received its really very nice catalog that you can see here. This was so-called the first international exhibition of conceptual art in Belgrade, because many international artists gave their works, mostly works on paper, to Razzo and Nena. And finally, the third exhibition, and if you read also the chronology made by Jelena Vesic, these of course, three exhibitions figure as foundational for new artistic practices in Belgrade and to institutional policies in Belgrade. Towards them, the third one, the exhibition Objects and Projects from October 1971, which really crystallized then this group of artists that has been recognizable of a so-called Belgrade group of 6 artists, Marina Abramović, Nesha Paripović, that you can see on the right, or Era Milivojević, Rasha Todosijević, you can see there down there, together with Zoran Popović and Gergely Jurkom, consisted their group. And this is their first basically joint exhibition. Again, here you can still sense that there is still this kind of relation to the object needed in order to conceive an exhibition. The exhibition was called Objects and Projects. I think that there was kind of influence of American minimalism quite strong, I would say, at that particular point in the Belgrade scene. And this idea of like bringing inside certain object that will be relational, that will be kind of relate to bodies in the way how the philosophy behind minimal art functions. But in the histories of exhibition practices, we can still treat this exhibition as more or less a conventional gallery space that contained objects. But nevertheless, from this moment on, so which means from October 1971 all the way to 1976, Student Cultural Center in Belgrade became like what would we call today the hub for various diverse artistic practices. And it was, in institutional terms, quite a unique story, because the relation between editors and artists, or between curators and artists, was blurred. Artists and curators and everyone interested and involved could participate at the meetings of the so-called redakcija of the Student Cultural Center, where the program was discussed. There was no particular program of the gallery, only few things that were kind of given, but everything else was conceived in the manner in which basically you could come up with an idea and realize it the next day. So in terms of the institutional policies, for example, in the youth center, in this gallery of the youth center, that was entirely different. Because in the youth center, there was this kind of strict administrative, bureaucratic procedure. You would apply for an exhibition as a young artist, and then maybe you will get your term, but in, I don't know, 10 months. So there was no way in which under this kind of system, you could generate this kind of urgency created by this contemporaneity of that moment, the contemporaneity that is established by the title "At the Moment" or "At another moment," this idea kind of involvement of an information in one particular moment, and everything that leads to something that that Jelena Vesic also coined the canon of contemporaneity, which of course we know today through the exhibitions of contemporary art and the very notion of the contemporary art. So we can call this time, and I usually in my text, call it early contemporary art to avoid this kind of misunderstanding. That I think that there's a kind of clear lineage between these practices, what is going on in the art world today. So this kind of gallery as a production space, but also not only a gallery, but the entire cultural center, because all these artists were practically invading the entire building, the surrounding of the building, everything in it, everything around it became an art event. Regardless this being some kind of, like on the left photograph, construction by Rasha Todosijević, or Era Milivojević putting these tapes over the mirror, or Era Milivojević, taping Marina Abramović, or lecture by Josef Beuys, giving there also a lot of foreign international artists were visiting Center for Contemporary Art at that moment. Foreign exhibitions were also arranged there. Famous Richard DeMarco came to the center, and then he brought a group of artists to his festival in Edinburgh in 1973, which was essential for the future career of Marina Abramović, for example, and so on. But in general, to cut the story for the history of exhibitionary practices, this was the moment that things were changing, and were changing inside an institution by the kind of full collaboration between actors. And also Museum of Contemporary Art followed this. So in 1973, another exhibition of this artistic practice happened in the Museum of Contemporary Art. This 1973, the exhibition documents on post-object phenomena in Yugoslav art. Interestingly, time De Negri was not kind of sure about how to coin this practice. Yeah, so in the first exhibition, it was called conceptual art. For the second exhibition, it's called post-object art. And we can see that from 1978, it would be called the new artistic practice. And now this is quite a big exhibition with a big number of participants that you can see here on the slide. This time, I would say also that this was the first, again, institutional exhibition in which tried to cover as much as possible practices that were linked to what De Negri tried to explain in his introductory text that you can see on the right. Rasha Todosijević with his performances. We will not have much time, to discuss each and particular work, of course. But I think I will just briefly say something, because it is on the. It's an image on the accompanying the title of my talk, with his performance Drinking Water, or one of the performances called either Decision is Art or Drinking Water. It's kind of related types of performances. In this particular performance, Rasha Todosijević is basically drinking water out of an aquarium in which a fish, a carp, was living and breathing. He took the fish out of the aquarium, and whilst the fish was dying out without breathing, Rasha was trying to drink this water. He then vomits this water, drinks again, and so on. And I would say that in terms of exhibitionary practices, this is together, of course, with performances by Marina Abramović, an exemplary moment in which it is not only about saying that the new that the exhibition of this practice needs a new type of exhibitionary practice, but also that the statement behind this was also the statement against these humanistic values that were attached always in the discourse, in the cultural discourse towards art production. The break here is made in the moment in which Russia is basically getting rid somehow of all this humanistic pathos in his works, and basically trying to somehow get out of this kind of a sanctuary of humanism in art that was behind this modernistic or high modernistic discourses in socialism, in which art was something by nature good, artists are someone by nature creative, it's a value per se, and all this kind of mantra, yeah? That this generation tried to broke with in a very strong and here in Russia to the sea, which is kind of aggressive and self-aggressive way that continued later. His most famous probably work, Was ist Kunst. I suppose that most of you have already seen this work in one of the versions in on the video, where he basically shouts at someone with this question, Was ist Kunst? This is one of the versions of Was ist Kunst with Patricia Hennings, where you can see this kind of austerity, of this kind of idea. You have someone, you know, it looks like an execution scene rather than exhibition, yeah? And in this scene, the artist is an interrogator, so he's not exhibited. You know what is he's shouting at the exhibition. He's kind of you know in the on the point that is again trying to change the logic of artistic production, the logic between the relation between the artist and observer. So this logic is to change. I think that this photo is somehow giving a lot of meaning to not only to the work of Rasha Todosievich, but in general to this kind of altering paradigms in exhibition making. But in general, when today someone is thinking about the Belgrade Conceptualism, Cultural Center, and about the exhibitionary practices, this photo would be somehow stealing the show. You know, this is like the most kind of always the most kind of visible or most typical document about this time, about these personalities, because you can see, and you can see also here this kind of collective spirit, this idea, again, that was at that moment extremely novel in the local scene, of the idea of an artistic collective, with the idea that the artistic collective is not only artists or not only those who like maybe trained as artists and so on, but everyone who is involved in the work of the gallery, everyone who is involved in the work of the cultural center becomes a part of a collective, and again takes this artistic individualism out of the story, and as the protagonists of the group would say themselves, you know, most of their works, it's impossible to say who come up with the idea and who realized the idea. It was a part of a collective venture. This photograph was made in 1972 for the April meetings of 1972. There were these traditional October and April meetings in the Serbian Cultural Center, where the kind of larger exhibitionary projects, for me, this photo is very interesting because it became one of the first works of an artist who came a bit later to the group and who's not on the photo. His name is Goran Đorđević, who for the April meeting 1974 projected this image on the wall where the protagonists were photographed as his own work. And this was one of the first works of Goran Đorđević, which is basically telling about this kind of strange awareness that happened during that time, that everything that was once new, after a few years, slowly becomes obsolete. And this is the group that in the only 2, 3, 4 years of their joint practices and so on, found out how the entire loop of that starts with the novelty and provocation ends up in some kind of a manner, or that was what Goran Đorđević was sensing what is going on already in 74, 75, that he wanted to somehow address this kind of issue. And then this issue was addressed in the most strong terms with this film, or no, this film, but with the project that, again, Jelena Vesić was researching and writing about, called October 1975, which I don't have time really to play the whole film. I can switch on the. But anyway, where this event in October 1975 marked somehow symbolic end of the whole story, because it showed there's a need for an additional political understanding of this particular practice within the cultural and political environment of Yugoslavia. Because the whole establishment of Student Cultural Center followed somehow the ideology of socialist self-management. It was a cultural example of self-management, or what self-management was supposed to be in the cultural and artistic practice. So they decided jointly to somehow get out with their statements, very, very strong and very political statements that were, in a sense, starting not only challenging the traditional forms of art, but also challenging the very institution of art. And I would say that already by 1976, this became quite obvious, especially during the visit of the Art and Language Group, or the New York branch of the Art and Language Group in Belgrade in 1975. This is a image on the left is used by the Art and Language as this kind of relation. Sezgin Bojnik in an exhibition in Ljubljana was recently, or at least a year ago, using also this image where you have Goran Đorđević and also Jasna Tjerdović, who was curator of the Museum Modern Art in Belgrade, and also together with Ješe de Negri, one of the people who were somehow both in the institution, but also participating in the alternative scene and providing this link between the alternative institution. With this idea that was also expressed by Goran Đorđević in one of his texts in the publication, or in the journal, The Fox, that was published by the New York branch of Art and Language Group. Zoran Popović and Goran Đorđević started, and Jasna Tjerdović started collaborating with the Fox, also publishing their essays. And this is where the radicality of this Yugoslav non-conformist artist and the radicality of the left-oriented artist in the West somehow met together. And the outcome of it is somehow expressed in this sentence by Goran Đorđević from his text on the class character of art, which he openly says art is primarily the result of an illusion of freedom, which was a direct attack on the very foundation of not only the modernist humanism, but the very foundation of the so-called new artistic practices as well, given that Joseph Beuys, for example, was probably the most influential artist on the Belgian scene at the moment. So art is primarily the result of an illusion of freedom and not a way of expressing the liberties of human beings. So this totally goes against this logic. Every activity of which the goal is the assertion of an artistic consciousness represents at the same time the prolongation of that illusion. And this is something that Goran Đorđević, and I would always say when we're thinking about the histories of exhibitions in Student Cultural Center and as the histories of the exhibitions of new practices in Student Cultural Center. If the Angularium was the first exhibition in 1971, then this exhibition in January 1980 could be symbolically the last exhibition of the new artistic practices in the main gallery, although of course most of these artists continued, but again, the artistic climate was changed. We don't have to this is like historical circumstances that of course, at the end of the 70s, early 80s, what happened in politics, what happened in artistic and cultural viewpoints. Đorđević arranged his exhibition that was openly entitled Against Art, with this statement that you can read here, and an exhibition was entirely consisting of copies of famous works of art from history of art, starting with Beuys, starting with Karl Andre, starting with this major figure of new artistic practice, and bringing them all together in this kind of lame story of the history of art. Goran Đorđević was, of course, will make an important impact also on the Slovenian Ljubljana scene later. This is a photo from the Zagreb exhibition of his copies. Of course, I don't have time now. I have underestimated myself in terms of timing, so I will not go into Đorđević here. But you can read this, of course. Who is interested to read more about Đorđević. I have written about Đorđević in this exhibition in particular, so I can of course send, you can also find it on my academia page. Again, Museum Contemporary Art continued their interest in new artistic practices despite of these changes. I would say that this is the first retrospective exhibition of an artist of a new artistic practice in Belgrade. This was in Salon of the Museum Contemporary Art, retrospective by Goran Trbuljak, which is basically consisting of 3 sentences that are connected to the one sentence, and each of the 3 sentences belong to some of his previous exhibitions. So together they form what he says a continuity in his work and create some kind of a retrospective. So this is again in the Salon of the Museum Contemporary Art, but of course in 1983 finally let's say a Serbian version of the new artistic practice history was arranged in the Museum Contemporary Art. You all know probably the 1978 exhibition in Zagreb. And this is an exhibition, New Art in Serbia. Again, it is new art here. So it is interesting how this, there was this kind of constant debate and constant negotiation how to term this practice, how to name this practice. So it was conceptual art at the beginning, and then post-object art, and then new artistic practice. This is just here, it's just new art. That is the first historization. So the Museum of Contemporary Art organized the first historization of these practices, here. And finally, the last of the examples I want to share with you today, and which you can also, I will provide the link as a continuation somehow of this topic of mine, because then it could start another story. But I think this is also an important exhibition in Museum of Contemporary Art that is a retrospective Robert Smithson. And this is basically where I'm kind of ending this narrative, this kind of short chronology, and this is the moment where somehow I became aware of it, because this is the first exhibition I personally saw in the Museum of Contemporary Art. And until kind of recently, I was not even aware that I was kind of on observing such an important event, because the retrospective for Robert Smithson was not only the example of an on not only the example of an collaboration or example of exhibition of exchanges with, for example, American side, and which will go into this history of international exhibitions in Belgrade. This was one of the ideas that when Betty and I first discussed this, that I could maybe talk about this international exhibition that were happening in Belgrade from the 50s, for example, in 1956, the exhibition of American contemporary art, 1956, and then some other also exhibitions of foreign art. So it's not only, it's not only this, it's not only enters this story, but it enters the story about the new artistic practice, because practically the exhibition or the retrospective of Robert Smithson is the first and it remained the only retrospective exhibition of one major artist belonging to this new paradigm of art. And Robert Smithson is definitely not only belonging, but also discursively one of the essential artists for understanding the change of this paradigm, especially given his distinction between sight and non-sight, this relation, his dialectics between sight and non-sight, which helped, for example, Peter Osborne to, in his famous book, Anywhere Not at All, to construct a narrative about the ontology of contemporary art, the ontology of what we call contemporary art. So, but Smithson is kind of, interest in Smithson is growing and growing. And it's interesting that in Belgrade, we were able to see this exhibition and somehow to also to finish up the whole development of this new type of art with a major presence of international artists. So instead of talking about this exhibition, because I'm looking at the clock and this is not good for me, because I should end very, very soon. As you can see, there's a lot of material to be presented, and of course, a lot of remarks that I simply missed. So in order to leave space for discussion, I will relating to this exhibition by Robert Smithson. If you have nerves to continue listening to me, there is a lecture of mine on this website. You can see it, ups and downs and highs and lows. This is a project by the Center for Cultural Decontamination in Belgrade from last year, which is researching different aspects of this Yugoslav American, Serbian American cultural relations. So I did a research, detailed research about this particular exhibition. So you can find on this website all the material, correspondence, press clipping, photographs, installation photographs of this exhibition, and of course the lecture of mine together with the presence of Jesha De Negri, who again, so we can say that without Jesha De Negri, we might not be able to tell the story, because he somehow stands at the beginning and also kind of at the end of this narrative, that Jesha De Negri, together with Peter Hobbs, an American curator who was researching Smithson at that time, came up with this idea to try to persuade both the American and the Yugoslav side to cover the costs of this show. And this show really indeed happened in Belgrade in autumn 1983. So on this website, you have the catalog, a PDF of the catalog. You have different texts about Smithson, texts that include also texts by local artists like Raša Todesivić, who is writing about Smithson and writing exactly about this relation between the site and the non-site. And somehow with the Smithson exhibition, the whole story somehow wrapped up in order to show that what the local art practice was a part of a general relation with the international scene. And I would say that in no time ever in Serbian art, like in this time between 1967 and 1983, the local artistic scene was somehow also the part of the international scene. So for details of this for this particular project, which I find extremely important because it's also a part of my life and my upbringing, you can read all this. Also, my lecture is in Serbian with the subtitles there. So, who is interested in this particular case study, please visit this website, and not only for my case study, but also for other case studies that are in other cultural fields, but also telling different, very interesting stories that go, of course, beyond our topic of exhibition making and exhibitionary histories. So I think, as far as I agree, I'm already past my limit. Yeah. So I would like to thank you, also to maybe apologize if I was kind of rushing through and maybe not detailed enough about certain things, but there's a lot of things to be said. I can, of course, share to everyone additional reading, additional texts. Particularly recommend the text by Jelena Vesic about this particular period. About the Novi Sad, I recommend the text by Nebojša Milenković. Nebojša Milikić was mentioned, so I also text by Nebojša Milikić, but about other topics. Finally, also kind of my text about Goran Đorđević. I think so. I can share this with you as an additional reading for students. So thank you very much for listening.
Branko, I would like to thank you for this intriguing lecture. Yes, it was quick, but you opened very many very interesting topics. So I guess there are questions for you, and I would like to invite our guests to pose questions, or by raising hand, or they can, if they wish, also write their questions into chat. Yeah, do we already have any
comments, not even questions. Comments,
yes, also are very, I mean, we have comments, but I will not be reading them because they are flattering. So they're comments for you, Branko, like, you know, people thanking and mentioning what great lecture there was, and that is true. But yeah, do we have any questions? Please. Otherwise, I will start asking, and then I will just not stop.
Nebojša Milikić raised hand, so I guess please unmute and pose a question. Nebojša Milikić.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm in the street. I had to pack and get out. This is why I may be interrupted. So just a short hint relating to the work performance by Raša Todosijević with the fish and him like trying to catch a breath or to catch water in a wrong position, being in a wrong position in elementary living needs. I just want to remind that in the second half of the 60s, the great debate, political, cultural as well, was dominant in entire Yugoslav society, with a specific developments in specific republican or national contexts. And it was about the crossroads between going further on the way of reforms, whatever we think about them, or going back to some sort of more let's say, socialist welfare state paradigm. And that in this performance, I can read like straight on, like now that in fact the art didn't contribute much to that debate, because you can read this work in both ways. Like the liberal elite, whichever national background of it, could read it. Come on, we need more investment. We need more strict regime of economy. So we are throwing away resources into into living standards of working masses, and vice versa. It would be working masses like elite and like techno-managerial elite, cultural elite, political elite is consuming much more and like totally unnatural resources that could be invested in development, not only of living standards, but of the socialist project itself. So, I mean, this work, we can read it as registrating it, but not taking a side. And I think that it is problematic in it. And I can, but because the Goran Đorđević text was mentioned, I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Nebojša. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It is kind of course, from today's standpoints, we can, of course, try to find elements in this culture that would lead to the situation that we have now. And in terms of the political situation at that moment, it is interesting, for example, with relation to the Novi Sad events, to say that what was called the liberal reformist wing of the Communist Party at that moment, which is usually praised as some kind of improvement of the socialist system, was exactly the one who was suppressing this, let's say, more anarchistic behaviors of the Novi Sad artists, which Belgrade artists didn't have, at least not till the 1975, October 1975 exhibition, which was then outspoken. So it is interesting local dynamics, tells about certain myths that we all have to kind of debate and discuss. Of course, in my lecture, I didn't want to address this issue because the topic was the exhibition histories and the types, the forms of exhibitionary practices.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that practically in every republic, the situation was a bit different politically, and you know that also the influences from where those practices somehow started were, I think, different. No. In Slovenia, one of the things that is not so often mentioned, I mean it is, but I think it would be more in the foreground regarding the Bocek Group, is the influence of the Italian art scene. Tomaž Šalamun and Tomaž Brejc and also others, you know, they were visiting Italy, and they somehow there came into touch with all kinds of different artists or other phenomena, like, you know, kind of early discotheques and so on. But I would not think that other new art practices, groups or artists were also somehow influenced by Italy, or maybe Croatians, not just in Serbia or in Vojvodina.
Well, if we take that Tješa De Negri was a part of these events and the creation of a discourse behind these events, then we can say also yes, because Italy was very influential for him. De Negri, a year before, and for example, in 68, 69, he was traveling through Italy, meeting different people. He also met Germano Cellant, and I think that this meeting between Germano Cellant, his friendship between him and Biljana Tomic and Germano Cellant was absolutely the most important trigger for his own, given that De Negri was not raised in this spirit. De Negri was I would say, the child of the Zagreb new tendencies. He was the one who was at that moment, 1968, 69, obsessed with this kind of technological paradigm, or this kind of shift between this kind of constructivist tendencies or neo-constructivist tendencies in the early 70s into computer art and this luminokinetic art and everything that came out of that kind of a logic, and that for him, some of my insights are based on the series of discussions that Jelena Vesic and I mentioned for the 100th time today. Jelena Vesic and I conducted with Ješa de Negri, which is a forthcoming book. I hope that by the end of this year we finally have this book of discussions with Ješa de Negri published, where he is trying to kind of explain this particular moment of his own awareness, how he became aware of it. And he said, well, this was through Biljana Tomic, that one exhibition where he was obsessed with this kind of huge luminokinetic installations and these environments and this kind of vogue. Biljana Tomic found out a couple of discarded stuff, discarded things that looked not belonging to an exhibition. And she said, well, this is most interesting, this show. And it was like newspapers by Luciano Fabro, for example, or some other work by Arte Povera. It was totally denying the spectacularity of an exhibition that also new tendencies were part of. So this idea of this kind of ephemeral in exhibition, something that's not like put straight into your head as a spectacle, but of course, to go beyond the spectacle, which is also the spirit of time, the spirit of the Borgian critique of spectacle, and so on. So yes, if this is the question, the Negri's base is very much Italian, and also some Italian artists were also participating in this student cultural center events. There is a book also by De Negri written about all this, called the International Program of the Student Cultural Center, texts that relate to all these appearances of some international artists in Student Cultural Center.
Mm-hmm. You were also mentioning how early those practices were presented in, let's say, official galleries in Yugoslavia. For me, it was always interesting that in Moderna Galleria, where director was Zoran Kržišnik, already in '67, they were planning to exhibit those things in Moderna Galleria. And then actually they were exhibited already in '68 and in '69. So I find it really interesting, because usually we say, yeah, those practices were present in the youth culture. But yeah, the interesting part is also that the kind of the biggest institutions for modern art were also presenting this, and I would say really early on.
Yeah. I agree. It's very important. I mean, for me, it's very important to notice that, especially in order to some counter this usual stereotypical, which is of course now breaking, but for many years there was this kind of usual stereotypization that there existed in socialism, so-called official culture and so-called dissident culture. This is somehow outside of the institution. With the example of this kind of a practice, we see that institutions were not only following, but also somehow initiating this. So that in Belgrade, even without the institution, who knows how this practice will be. So this is saying a lot about the quality of these institutions, about the emancipatory potential behind this institution. In general, the kind of the way the cultural policy was addressed to this so-called experimental art as well, not only to something that they could consider the part of the cultural tradition.
I could further go on this, but we have one very long question here in chat, so I will read it, or do you maybe see it, Branko?
I'm reading it now.
It's a question by Marko Jenko, and he is, asking about Tito's, yes,
the Tito's
modern abstract art, yeah.
So sorry, it would be best to read it out loud because we won't be able to see it in YouTube. I can read it. I can read Marco said.
So I missed the 20 minutes of a lecture. You mentioned socialist time modernism. Could we go back to the beginning of the 60s for a minute? How do you see Tito's two strangely ambivalent speeches against modern abstract art? Basically, 3 years before, he opened Belgrade Museum of Contemporary Art, which can be seen as some sort of cathedral of modernism. Why this dichotomy? And do you agree with Tvrtko Jakovina or Ljiljana Kolešnik's take on this topic? Well, this will be now kind of, Marko will have to tell us, more precisely what is Jakovina and what is Kolešnik saying about this. I mean, just briefly, this is, of course, a very interesting thing because, first of all, these two speeches, what I have sort of grasped, and I still didn't find out anything else, the only two speeches really that he mentioned in a public speech, his taste and opinion about art is in this 1962 speeches. And historians say that both of these speeches happened after Tito visited Khrushchev. And after the melting of the thawing of the relations between Yugoslavia and Soviet Union. As you know, the Yugoslavia broke with Stalin in 1948, and it took some time when Stalin died and Khrushchev took over for this relation to better. So Tito had a very long visit to Khrushchev, in a month-long visit to Soviet Union. And interested immediately after this visit, he started somehow repeating the speech that would be more characteristic for the Soviet discourse, official discourse, than for something that we saw in Yugoslavia. So one could say that these speeches are somehow related to that, and they were like kind of signal, maybe internal political party signals. But apparently they didn't affect in any sense the building of the museum, the opening of the museum, and the policy of the museum. And what needs to be said about the general cultural policy, because today you have a lot of these stories, for example, how Tito personally was influencing some of them. And there is even like a film called Cinema Comunisto, in which, after watching this film, you somehow got the impression that Tito was deciding which films should be made, which films should be screened, and so on. And this is like kind of really a bit of a myth. It doesn't say that, of course, he didn't have an opinion about it. And his opinion towards modern art was definitely negative. But this was not such a system of kind of authoritarianism in which one man was kind of really deciding about the cultural policy. So for me, this anecdote and this relation between Tito's speech and the beginning of the building of the Museum of Contemporary Art is just a good illustration how basically negotiable the cultural policy was, and especially given the most important fact that especially during the 50s and until the early 60s, the main decision makers in the cultural policies, particularly in Serbia, were artists mostly linked to the pre-war surrealist movements who were communists, like Koča Popović, like Marko Ristic, like Vučo, and other members of the surrealist group from the 20s and the 30s became very prominent figures. And I think that this is something that didn't happen anywhere else. It is very, very rare phenomena that such kind of individuals from the artistic background, from a radical artistic background, were in the position of, let's say, some kind of a cultural power, and no doubt that they were also influencing the positive outcome behind Protic's proposal. And as I said at the beginning of the lecture, Protic was not even the member of the Communist Party, so it was possible to establish the entire museum in socialist Yugoslavia without even being a member of the party. Maybe this is not in the reply to Marco's question, but at least some going back to the beginning, going back to the early 60s.
But Branko, sometimes I have a feeling that, you had a country, you knew that there are a lot of people which are also against spending money in such a manner, you know, giving it to modernist art. So, you know, I think they just simply decided that he has to say something against it, and then that will be, you know, somehow good for everybody. You know, people in high modernism, they will have their own piece and the rest will be happy because declaratively he said that that is not okay. Do you find that possible?
It is possible. Of course, I don't have a kind of to prove that.
I think, you know, that these people were really smart and they were, you know, kind of.
Oh yeah, they were definitely, but this we can agree definitely.
You know, they were kind of trying.
Comparison to the politicians we have today.
Yes. Yeah, they could have learned something. No, because also, you know, when I'm researching the monuments, you know, the story is very similar. Tito is completely absent of everything. It is really rarely that he would come and say something, maybe at the opening, and that is. Yeah,
I think that only Jasenovac's monument was somehow his decision. Everything else, you know, he didn't participate.
But even, you know, with Jasenovac's monument, I think it has to be declared as his decision because of this terrible problem between the Croatians and the Serbians. So I think, you know, it was good for the project to be embedded somewhere very, very high, I would say, or yeah, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Also, Nebojša Milikić, you see, he wrote, also Tito from early 60s, it's time the generations which undertook this great project start to benefit from it.
Yeah, but this is exactly something what this generation tried to counter. Yeah, and 1968 demonstrations were about that, you know.
No, but at the same time, you know, very often those people who were counter that, they were kind of jeunesse dorée of the country, because in Zagreb, in Serbia, and in Slovenia, the people who were involved, they were all very often children of very high bureaucrats or, you know, national heroes and so on. I was asking once Tomasz Brejc, how come you didn't have any problems? And he said very nicely, how could we have them? We were their children. They could not harm us. So yeah, it's a complicated situation.
Yeah, I mean, many of this is the main people in cultural field in Yugoslavia were children of army officers, you know, and someone did research about that, you know, how many of these people with this kind of a really alternative culture, you know, they had this background in, you know, and this is one of the reasons why the film by Lazar Stojanovic, Plastic Jesus, was banned, you know, because there is a wedding with presence of these army officers there, because he himself, Ljubiša Ristić Kopija there, was also a son of an army general and so on. Yeah, but this is a very interesting, could be a very interesting research.
Do we have some more questions or some more comments maybe? Maybe also, you know, I always have a problem with this new art practice, with this term. Mm-hmm. This is a hard question for the end. But still, you know, in Slovenia it's not very popular. Mm-hmm. Also because I think somehow really linked to these practices in Croatia and in Serbia, which are then very strong, is only the movement OHO and then group OHO or people related to that like Srećo and Nuša Dragan. I don't know why it is like that. Do you agree very much with this term, or you think it would be better if we would call that with some other name? Or
well, I mean, it's all the kind of terms are operative, and you know, as you can see, it was not really decided, because it was, you know, if you call it initially, it was called conceptual art. Then you realize there is the kind of narrow definition of conceptual art, which basically narrows down to the analytical work in which the concept in conceptual art is art itself. Yeah, so it is not about this kind of idea It is about the concept of art. And this is so with this awareness, I think that this was somehow dropped as an overall. So conceptuality is just a part of the new artistic practices, with land art, with body art, with other practices is one part. So this was the idea behind this new artistic practices to kind of to have an overall term. But it is something, there is something, I tend now to call it early contemporary art.
That's how you call it.
I call, yeah. I mean, I started calling it like this. You know, I think that contemporary, there's a canon of contemporary art. We are now in a late phase of contemporary art. The question is that we still call it contemporary art because we are not aware what will happen behind it. And as any artistic phenomena, it has in a very banal way always this kind of early developed and late phase. So I would say that, you know, that at this times of the early 60s, of the late 60s, early 70s was this early contemporary art. What we saw in the 90s was this kind of developed contemporary art, and today this is this late phase of contemporary art, was kind of decadent phase of contemporary art. But of course, this is now this is a very kind of a basic. So that's why because simply what we can confirm today is that this type of artistic practice that combines exhibitionary, performative, cinematographic, poetic, is something that started at that moment, of course, with a certain awareness and with a certain idea of the historical avant-garde, and that this abandoning of the media-based modernism, or what Terry they would call media-based modernism, towards this kind of generic modernism, is also that the idea that you kind of freely basically combine this different sources. And this is for the first time, for example, this Novi Sad group, neither one of them was educated in an artist. They didn't go to an art school. All of them are literature students or philosophy students and so on. So there's no longer a question of the academic upbringing, but the question of starting something entirely new. And this entirely new is now institutionalized, and we call it contemporary art.
No, but still, you know, I think early contemporary art, again, that could be something very confusing. Then you would say early contemporary art from Yugoslavia or from Serbia, and you would somehow then talking about certain phenomena, you would put then...
Well, if you would have to write a history of contemporary art, you would have to start at that time.
Yeah. You know, you were mentioning that they were not necessarily art students. What is interesting with Bocek Group is actually that people involved or very close to Bocek Group were all art historians, and very, very good art historians. That is like Tomasz Šalamun, Milenko Matanović, Tomasz Brejc. And actually, you know, they were trying to somehow make them assistants at our department, but they had other plans, so that didn't happen. And actually, I think it was this art historical upbringing which gave them certain knowledge, a certain self-awareness of how things in art are not necessarily something that you have to be dedicated completely for your whole life. I think that helped them, you know, to have this approach to art as a play where you try a little bit of this, try a little bit of that, and you go further than kind of very easily. And then when Marko Pugachnik, who was an artist, came back from the army to this group of art historians, then things changed again. And this movement very quickly, you know, picking different kind of approaches and trying them and playing with them, then suddenly stopped. So yeah, here maybe we can go further to a question of Marko Jenko. And a question goes, with all the institutional support or growing support for new art, do you perhaps know why Putter's concept for the Venice Biennial fell through? it is somewhat of a myth here, but supposedly it was all Kožušnik's fault, a bit of gossip.
Yeah, but no, we can ask De Negri about it. Marco is thinking about but it was 1976 Putar Venice Biennial, where also not a group of Ho, but it was the commune of Pogačnik. Yes, Šempas, that they participated in this 1976.
No, they participated, Branko, they participated, I think, then in 78 in the selection of Macedonian, yes, in the selection of when the Macedonians were sending artists to Venice Biennial, and Oho Group, I think it was then the family from Šempas was sent there in that context. But yeah, the story goes that, you know, that they should be there before, and that the Kožušnik was, you know, doing some kind of a problem and so. But here,
what is interesting about Marco's question, of course, he will need to explain more about what he is referring to when he says it. But what is the point I think Marco is making here, which is something very important, that it may seem, if for someone who is listening to my talk, that this institution was very really advanced and you know, supporting this, but it's heavily exaggeration. It was not the case, but they were open for those who were involved in this practice to somehow affect the work of the institution. For most of the curators of the Museum of Contemporary Art, this new artistic practice was simply a stupidity. De Negri told, this also resulted in a very small number of works from this practice that were purchased by Belgrade Museum, especially in that time in the 70s and 80s. Only a few of these works were bought by the museum. Then later in the early 2000s, museum then repurchased some of the major works from this period. So in the collection of the Museum of Contemporary Art, this practice is not represented properly, or especially at that time was not represented properly. Why? Because they tolerated this as some kind of experiment, but they couldn't tolerate this becoming a museum value, becoming something that becomes a part of the institution, something that enters this kind of a narrative of the so-called confirmed and affirmed value in art. And the first work that was purchased by Museum of Contemporary Art, and this is De Negri told me this anecdote, was in 1976 or 77, a work by Gergely Urkom, one of the Belgrade 6 artists, which was this kind of Xerox of the work of a watch. So it was like a series of Xeroxes that are copying the operation of a clock, and basically the machine is somehow is somehow recording the duration of time. You know, typical, very good, typical conceptualist work. So when De Negri finally persuaded the curatorial team, because the curatorial board was deciding about these issues, that museum should put this on the list of possible acquisitions. A person who was in charge in the graphics department, because there were departments and all these works needed to be put into a different part of the collection. So this Xerox, because of the nature of the media, was to be placed in the collection of the graphic art. And then she said, my God, but in a few years' time, this would wane, this would fade. We will not have this work. What will happen in 20 years if a commission comes and asks me, where is this work? And the work simply disappears. You know, so it was like a tough time to explain that this kind of art needed to be registered, recorded, and purchased also. And this is really the moment where the whole story in the late 70s somehow faded away. Because it was interesting whilst it was an experiment. But at the moment when it was the debate whether this particular practice has some kind of a value to put it into the museum context, the museum collection, then and to pay some money for that, you know, one conservative critic said, well, I can understand this experimental art, but when Rasha Tudisiewicz is trying to get the fee for this stupidity of his, you know, then I don't understand. If they want to do it, let them do it. But if they want to really kind of be professional artists with this is beyond question. And this is the moment in which practically Museum for Contemporary Art slowly kind of faded with this interest. And Smithson Show was somehow the final one in this line until the 2000s. That nothing much happened in this area of exhibitionary practice in this relation. And what is also interesting, the museum somehow very fondly and kind of very enthusiastically embraced the shift of artistic paradigm at the early 80s and the so-called new image, trans-avantgardia, new expressionism, and so on. They saw how finally something is going on that we can really exhibit. So the very year, what I'm saying, the very year when the Smithson Show and the new art show happened in Belgrade, also the exhibition called The 80s happened in Belgrade. So this was the quickest response of an institution. So already in 1983, Museum Contemporary Art had an exhibition called The 80s in order to promote this new generation, primarily of painters and sculptors, you know, as a kind of a paradigm that will give a rebirth to more conventional understanding of art.
Yeah, complex topics, kind of never-ending debate could be going on about that. Well, I think we are here already more than 2 hours. So if there are no pressing questions, I think it would be time to slowly conclude. Obviously, it is very good to invite Branko, so we will try to invite him very soon again. But for today, I would like to thank him. It was really not only informative, I think it was something that will give us, you know, food for thought, for further thought. So thank you, and thank you all that you were listening, that you were with us, that you were posing questions. So yeah, come please again to our next events. And for today, I wish everybody good night.
Thank you, Betty. Thanks to all. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.